Okay, so the next session holding here is building powerful APIs with Django, Django Rest Framework, and OpenAPI. Leading the session is Velda Kiara. So please put your hands together for Velda Kiara. Hi.
Hi. Hi. Okay. Hi, everyone. How are you doing? I need energy. I know you've spent the whole day attending to different sessions, but right now we're going to talk about building powerful APIs using OpenAPI, Django, and Django Rest Framework. So my name is Velda Kiara. I'm a software engineer and also a WTM ambassador and the Oscar Nairobi lead. So that's all about me. So we're going to get right into it. So the goal of this session is not only go through the steps of building an API, but actually designing the API spec. So quick story, when I was younger, my granddad and I used to hang out a lot. And he knew I was a sweet tooth. So most of the times, I don't know if, can I get the slides on the screen, please? Okay, as I wait for that. So he used to take me to a particular candy store that I really loved, the sweets. So most of the times would get particular sweets that were sweet and sour. They weren't that sweet, they weren't that sour, they just had a sweet spot at the middle, right? So every time we used to go to the shop, the person who was at the store was normally called Lucy. She was a really nice person, and she ensured I got my sweets because I loved sweets, and the only way I could get sweets is through my grandparents. My parents never allowed me to have sweets, you know, like all good parents don't want children having sweets, right? So every time we'd get sweets, I'd get the same particular sweet every single time. So there's a particular day, those sweets weren't available. But then she suggested another particular sweet, which was purple and green, but was actually really sweet. So in this case, what an API is it gets requests and delivers responses to particular users based on the request that has been made. In this case, my granddad and I were actually the clients sending requests to Lucy, who's actually the API, telling us whether the red sweets that I wanted were available or not. And if they weren't available, she would easily either request us or probably get other sweets for us, right? So the store in this case is actually the server. Everybody now on the same page with what an API does? Awesome. So going on, a few things before we even start getting into APIs. There are different types of APIs. The first is web APIs that allow you to access data and functionality through web servers. A good example of this is Google Maps, sorry. A good example is Google Maps because you're able to easily key in the location that you want to see the distance, estimate the time, and all that. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is machine-to-machine APIs. They actually allow you or allow devices to communicate with each other without human intervention. A good example of this is AWS IoT Core API. So it allows you to connect your devices to the cloud, and then the cloud can communicate with the devices without any human intervention. The next APIs we're going to look at is GraphQL APIs, which are becoming increasingly common. So GraphQL APIs allow you to query specific data that you need and then return specific data that you actually want. So this improves performance and also improves the bandwidth that you're actually supposed to have. And then we have SOAP APIs, which use simple object access protocol. A good example of this is Salesforce, which is actually a CRM for customer relationship management that allows you to access customer information that you actually need. And then what we're actually going to talk about is REST APIs, which use representational state transfer protocol, and this is what we're going to look at today. So it uses particular actions that you need to do, like put, delete, create, and all that. So another thing you also need to know is that the responses you're going to get. So if you've worked with APIs, you know that you can easily get the most common error 404, that's like the things that you're looking for are not found, or 403, forbidden, especially if you're working with APIs that need authorization. So the first digit represents the class that the error belongs to, and the last two digits specify what the error is. So in this case, every error that starts with 1 is informational, which means the request has been received and it's continually being in process. And then the classes that start with 2 are the request is actually successful. And then every error that starts with 3 is redirection. That is, you need to perform more actions for this request to be fulfilled. And then 4, obviously, like 404 means that this is an error either caused by bad syntax or you're not able to access the particular resources that you have. And then 5 means that the server wasn't able to fulfill your request. So common HTTP codes, I talked about 404, which is you're not finding the resource you have. 500 is internal server error. 403 and 401 is you don't have the right access levels. And then 400 is bad requests. I don't know if we can. All right. So when you're building APIs, you need to actually have the structure beforehand, because you don't want to just build on top of your head thinking that, okay, I'm going to start with code first, and then we'll circle back to knowing how the API is going to look like, because that then will have a challenge because you also need to go on documenting, you still need to work with other teams. So I'd highly advise every time you're building a particular software, kindly start with API first approach. So the reasons why I'd advocate for this is because you're able to separate concerns of both the front end and the back end. And all these teams need to be able to know what particular button does, what that endpoint looks like, what data gets sent to the back end. The other thing is flexibility and scalability. You're able to scale because you all know what the endpoints are and what the endpoints are supposed to do, so it's clear to everyone. And then there's also collaboration and parallel development, where both teams can work synchronously because you're all in an agreement that this endpoint is supposed to do this. If it's a product endpoint, it's not going to return issues or customer feedback, right? And then the other thing is you have clear and consistent interfaces, because everybody knows that this page is for products, this other page is going to be the checkout page, this other page is going to be for payments and all that. So it also makes documentation easier and also onboarding of the various engineers that come into the company that you're actually working for. And also for future proofing, because APIs are language agnostic, so it doesn't matter whether you're building your API with Node or Flask or even Django. So a few things that would like to go over is when you're building the API, I used OpenAPI, that is Swagger in this case, and there are a few things that you need to note. Like at the very top, I don't know if you'll be able to see this. I need to. Okay. So I think as they work on that, a few things to know is that on the API spec, there's normally the information, title, description of what the API does, what's the specification of the Open API they're using, yes. And then the paths define, you see how you go into, say, a product, and then there's always the name up top of, let's say, product one, and then the slash with an ID. So the path is basically that. What does the endpoint point to? And then the responses are what you get, whether it's successful, whether you also have errors, or whether there's any challenge. And then there are also parameters that you could identify, or rather ensure that before people even run the tests, they are able to see. And then responses define what people get as a response. Parameters are what is going to be accepted by the different operations you have. Let me just quickly take you through how it actually looks like. Okay. I don't know if you can. Yeah. So that is how you could build a particular endpoint. As I mentioned at the top is the info title version. For this case, the first path we are looking at is merchandises. What merchandises is that it gets all the particular products that are under that particular endpoint. And then if you also want to create a new item under merchandise, it's also possible. As you could see, the summary, the operation ID is a unique identifier that tells you that this is the post method that's going to be used. Request body basically returns the responses that you need. As you could see that we also defined the different error messages. You need to be very clear also about what error messages people will get, what are the descriptions, and how to move forward from there. So in this case, we have one list that gives you all the merchandises that are there, and then the ID that gives you the particular specification for one merchandise. Say one merchandise has the name, ID, and price, but then the list is going to show you item 1 with name, ID, and price, item 2, and all that. But if you want to see what is actually in one item, you could have the merchant ID next to the merchandise path. So this is how it looks like. And then you also need to define errors in your schema so that you're able to actually have them here as shown. Okay. So moving on to now the code. So when I was actually doing this project for authentication and authorization, I used JSON, JWTs for tokenization so that we get access tokens and refresh tokens for the different users. And I could test it out right now. Let's go to I need to show. Okay. So you are actually supposed to see how this looks like. But anyway, we could move forward. So when you're creating a Django project, there's a default homepage, which I don't like using because it normally has the different endpoints you have. But I think I'll be showing that in a few minutes. What you need to know is that every time you're writing code, obviously you need to have authorization and authentication fast. And then every time you create a Django project, it comes as a project, but then you could have different applications inside, right? So the applications perform particular services for that particular project. In my case, I had the merchandise as the project, and then I also had an app that was called merchandises to represent what particular items I had. So let's see if it actually works. Okay, I didn't want to have an empty home page, so that's why you have the first page as Open Source Festival 2023. Can you see that? Yeah. So once you are through looking at or having authorization and authentication through JWT and using Django Rest Framework, this is what you should actually get. Let's see, there's a user I created that can actually see if we'll get the access and refresh tokens. Yeah, so the particular authentication works. Now looking at if the merchandise endpoint works. Yeah, so we have a couple of, I don't know if you could see that. Yeah, so this is what was created before. An exciting thing about Django is that it uses object relational mapping. So instead of writing SQL queries, you could actually key in or interact with the database through the terminal. So the first endpoint I had was for merchandise. Let's see if we could add a particular item. Okay, all right. So I think, yeah. So if you'd like to create one from the shell, you have to run python manage py shell first. Yeah, and then since we had a model called merchandises, you'd like to import that first. And then since we're looking at particular IDs for merchandises, we'll use UUID, which is universal, unique identifier that allows you to pinpoint to exactly the product that you have. So we'll need to import UUID, and then now start defining the merchandise, say merchandise 35, and then have the first variable to store the first ID, which is that's the first variable. And then we also want to define the first item and the prices and all that that's already in the model. So merchandise is actually the model name. Okay, sorry. The ID we had mentioned here is merchandise 35/ID. And then we also have the name. We could do Oscar Fest. And then the price could be 45. Sorry. Yeah, and then merchandise 35, save. Okay, and then we could exit and see if it actually works. Yeah, so you could see that the endpoint actually works. And then a few things, I could walk you through how the code looks like. This is how the model for the models looks like. We had to create custom users because we want to define particular users that use the product. And then merchandises is the actual model with the ID, name, price, and description. And then serializers serialize the data that is being sent from being data structures to JSON because we are creating APIs. And then for the admin basically stores the particular application you have. The home HTML page is the page that you saw Oscar 1st, 2023. And then views are defining what data should actually be shown. And then you'll realize that the first query set is merchandise.objects.all. This is not only the function that you use, you could still filter and check out whether you want 1 result or 5 results. And then the main page, the settings.py page, is where every single time you create a new application, or if you install new tech, you need to add it here. Like we had merchandise, we used REST Framework, we used REST Framework Simple JT for tokenization. And then since we are using a static page, you also need to highlight this at the very bottom of the settings page. So I also wrote tests because tests are part of actually coding, and that you need to verify that whatever you're doing is working. So in this case, we need to test out if it's actually getting all merchandise, if it's creating merchandises, if it's updating and deleting. So we could test this out by looking at, let's see if the tests run. To be able to run tests, you could key in python manage.py test actually. So yeah, the tests work and everything works. So this is the merchandise list. If you want to look at particular items, you could easily copy paste that ID to the very top, and then it takes you to exactly what the particular details of the item are. And then the description, we could say we are at a conference and see if it works. And yeah, it works. So this is just an example of how you could write endpoints and interact with both Django and Django Rest. A few lists before I leave is, I wanted to highlight, you could scan this QR code, I don't know why it's not loading. It has the OpenAPI specification if you want to play around with it. The code is also available. These are the articles that you would learn more about Django overview and also using JWT. And then this is the code itself, but anyway, I'll still share it on Twitter, so you'll be fine. The last thing I'd want to talk about is best practices. You need to actively use good naming systems. Like I used merchandises and merchandise ID, and then the model name is merchandise in particular because it lists out particular items that you need to have. And then you also need to use the HTTP verbs correctly. You don't want to say put when you're actually deleting. You don't want to create, but when you're actually just patching. And then you also need to look at versioning, especially if there are any bugs with your specification or implementation, that you're not, if you move forward and there's a bug that needs to be patched up, you could easily revert back to the previous version. And then there's also proper error handling. You need to define the different errors there are, what responses that the user should get, and how to move forward. And then there's also authentication and authorization, which we handled using JSON. There are also a couple of other things, but I'll still share them with you. I'd like to ask if there are any questions. Okay. But I hope you know how APIs now work, you know how it's supposed to look like, how you can actually test your code, and basically I hope I got you interested in Django. I like solving bugs, so if you have bugs, you could easily tag me on Twitter and I'll help you out. And yeah, thank you for your time.